So let's talk about some mighty battlesuits, advanced railguns and alien auxilia, with a tier list of Tau Empire units in current Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tau, and in this video I thought it would be a good time to do an updated tier list for the faction, as really quite a lot has changed in the year or so since the Codex came out. Tau have certainly had some ups and downs over the course of 10th edition. After the Codex releasing, they were broadly doing very well for quite some time, though with a bit of Codex creep, with lots of armies gradually getting stronger between that and balance updates, plus a few choice nerfs to some standout things, and the Tau got to the point where they were perhaps one of the weaker factions in the game by the numbers. And newly added detachments such as the auxiliary cadre and the experimental prototype cadre, both of those added some fun and some genuinely strong ways to play, but not necessarily outright strength to the faction. In the recent balance updates though, Games Workshop seemed to have given them what they really needed, a nice core army buff, and for the greater good now just allowing one unit to guide the rest of the army into their one target, as opposed to having to awkwardly pair up. It made the army really quite hard to coordinate firepower with, and a bunch of problems, and definitely was a very direct buff to Tau shooting. It's kind of early days at the moment, though it certainly seems to have made them rise up in their stats. Win rates for around about 52% in the first couple of weeks since the balance update, one grand tournament victory using Cao Yon, though most people seem to be using Montcar as the detachment of choice. Will be interesting to see if they can still remain quite so high as they go onwards. With all this changes in mind though, I thought it would be interesting to revisit a Tau tier list, ranking all the units in the Codex and the Forge World ones for overall strength. After that I put them into 5 separate tiers, plus an S tier, and split tier 2 into an upper and lower half as well for good measure. Obviously Warhammer 40k tier lists are all very arbitrary, some things could be ranked very significantly higher or lower depending on the context of how things are played, terrain levels and casual versus competitive settings, and detachments also have a massive impact in 10th edition, things like the Retaliation cadre obviously giving you a focus on battlesuits, and the Crute relevant ones having much more use for their units. This one will mainly be looking at raw datasheet strength, though perhaps a bit of a focus on Montcar and Cao Yon, though we'll try and talk about some relevant detachment things as we go along. Jumping into it though, and for units that wouldn't be considered that strong, first up we've got the Manta, one of the crazy big and expensive Forge World units that is very rarely ever seen on the tabletop. I believe this one's the second most expensive model that Games Workshop make. It currently seems to be off sale at the moment, though hopefully they're just repairing the mould or something, sometimes they do with Forge World units. In any case, in game it's a ridiculously enormous Titanic flyer, 2,100 points, so you can't even field it in most competitive formats, so it's reserved for big fun apocalypse style games. A fairly crazy stack of stats with 60 wounds with a 2+ save and toughness 14, 2 big damage 12 rail cannon shots and a whole bunch of ion cannons, plus lots of support systems beyond that. The transport capacity is kind of hilarious as well, 200 infantry, 4 tanks and 8 suits, and it's just sort of feeling like it's playing 40k on a completely different scale to how most people would be. For the cost though, if you're looking for damage and defense, it's unlikely to outshoot its cost in raw firepower. You could have around about 14 hammerhead tanks for example for the cost of this thing. I think that's ultimately always going to do more. Still fun that this thing has rules that exist though, even if most normal players are never going to see it on the board. Moving on to tier 4, and these ones are slightly more practical units, though I'd still consider them perhaps stand out weak beyond some of the others. As ever, fortifications don't tend to do well in 10th edition 40k, though even here I'd say that the Tau ones are better than most. The Tide War ones can at least move around a little bit, and have a squad of fire warriors or something inside them. You can either get the shield line for 85 points with the invulnerable save, the drone port for some low strength attacks nearby, firing automatically against enemies that are in range, and then the gun rig for 90 points for one great big and wildly accurate railgun shot. You could have some fire warriors or pathfinders shoot out of it, though compared with something like a devilfish it is very slow, only moving 4 inches. It can't be guided or observed as it doesn't have the for the greater good special rule. If you're garrisoning it with fire warriors then you won't be able to use their -1 to hit debuff, and I feel like if you want to deliver infantry then generally the devilfish is going to be better. It'll move far faster and get them in range and with lines of sight. If going for one of these though, I'd probably be tempted by the gun rig, just for the very small chance that it actually lands a hit and then does something nasty to an enemy vehicle. I still not rate these quite as bad as some factions' fortifications though, maybe towards the upper end of this tier. Next up we've got the Taunar Supremacy Armour at 790 points. Again, this one's a massive great big centerpiece unit. Big stats at 30 wounds at toughness 13 with a 2+ save, and then it does have some fairly enormous gun profiles with those tri-axis ion cannons that you could swap out for melters, and then potentially some great big damage 16 railgun shots on the top of it. Though I do feel like all of its carapace mounted weapons are maybe just a little bit focused against one target, and might be a bit disappointed if they run into an army that doesn't have ideal profiles to take down. It did get a big buff with the changed Tau special rule though. It now no longer is penalised for splitting fire, which it really needs to do to be able to get enough value out of an 800 point model. This will be very efficient for any focal buffs that you can put on one single unit. Any usable stratagems have the potential to help it in a really big way. Again though, it's still rated as basically inferior to getting multiple smaller units with a whole bunch of firepower, likely being better off with 2 Storm Surges, never mind something like 5 or 6 Skyrays and Hammerheads. Finally for this tier, we've got the Tiger Shark. This one's the great big Forge World flyer that actually doesn't have too bad firepower stats for its cost. The most popular version is 325 points and gets a whole bunch of spammed ion cannon fire, plus a Alpha Strike battery of 6 Seeker missiles, plus a bunch of Strength 6 supporting fire. These ones did used to see a fair bit more tournament play, but Games Workshop have been pretty punishing to them by really making it work super badly with the aircraft rules. It's got to set up via strategic reserve and it's too big to fit within the deployment zone for that. And with designers' commentary rules, that means that it won't be able to do any actions at all in the turn that it turns up. So basically it will just turn up turn 2 and then sit there, take some firepower, and only basically start contributing to the game by turn 3, which is a bit on the late side. You could maybe try and get around that with rapid ingressing it. If you're going second, then it might be able to fire turn 2 if that happens. And again, it will quite enjoy the split fire style thing. Again, maybe not entirely unusable, but I feel like just the normal state of affairs being it turns up and then does nothing, it is pretty massive. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Tech. They're the makers of the Mechi series of carry cases, one quite different option for transporting miniatures amongst many. The idea behind their stuff is they have this component system where they've got various cunning mechanical contraptions to basically grip onto miniatures and hold them in place, holding onto the bases or the bottoms of the miniatures so they stay put in storage. There's a few different ways they do that, with rotating clips, some spring mounted things, or a lever mounted thing that can grip onto whole squads at a time. Then those components are mounted in various different cases. They've got these slider cases here where they can mount a custom array of different modules, choosing ones that are relevant for your army. They're pretty good with supports to tell you which ones you need and how they can be set up. Or they have some bigger display style ones like these slider case frames that can be set up with a bunch of different shelves for different height miniatures. The number 6 one can fit any 40k Combat Patrol box set, so it could be one way to get a custom case to go A to B in style for those. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. You can check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their range. I'll cycle back to them briefly at the end of the video to talk through some pros, cons and other examples of stuff they have. They do have an Auspex code for 10% off if you do happen to make any purchases through them too. Let's get back to the Tau units though, and in tier 3 here are a few data sheets that I feel like are either a bit overshadowed or niche, and again between them really quite unlikely to feature in competitive lists. First up there's the Firesight team. This guy's 70 points, which does have some interest as a lone operative that can infiltrate, generally good things in Warhammer 40k, but also doesn't really do all that much damage or provide much in the way of support beyond that. They get a small amount of fire support, though not loads. The AP-1 really doesn't help with that. Even if they can reroll hits against the spotted targets, they might be most tempting as sort of a placeholder unit to screen one area of the board. They could set up in the backfield and contribute a tiny bit to the game, either chipping in a tiny bit of firepower or marking units if that makes sense if there's no stealth suits on hand. And they do have the option to be used as an infiltrator as well. They're not really ideal for the role given that they're a single model 70 points and super easy to kill. They might be usable to bear some enhancements that you might want on the board somewhere. They are a character unit, but I feel like with the amount of rivals they have for their role, with things like Ghost Kills and Shadow Sun both being strong contenders for the lone operative role, they're probably going to be worth the extra points, and if you want an infiltrate unit it makes sense to upgrade the 20 points towards the Pathfinders, presuming that you're keeping stealth suits safe and guiding. For the other lone operative that are ranked here, there's the Kroot Lone Spear. He's 80 points, and I mainly say that he's kind of niche, as he's going to be far better in the 2 Kroot relevant detachments than elsewhere. I think for his raw stats and abilities, he's not too terrible. He moves pretty fast, even if he has to move around terrain as a mounted unit. And he gets move, shoot, move as well, which could have him move even faster across the board. He can either crack off shots at range with a sniper, and that could allow some long range buffs for Kroot units attacking the same targets, or have a bit more personal damage threat with that explosive spear lance that he gets. It's going to be way more helpful than Kroot Hunting Pack or Auxiliary Cadre. He can bear that Deny Deep Strike enhancement in Hunting Pack, and in both detachments he can buff the damage output of Krootox Rampagers, who can stack their damage really quite high in both of those armies. Outside of that though, again, he just doesn't really feel quite a standout against competing things, Shadow Sun and Ghost Kills in particular on the lone operative front. They'll still probably put him towards the upper end of this tier. Next up, we've got the 3 Kroot characters, who I'd likely put towards the lower end of this tier unfortunately. The Flesh Shaper's 45 points, he gets a 6+ Feel No Pain, a little bit of twin-linked melee damage, sustained hits for his Kroot unit in melee, and it's going to be more relevant in the Hunting Pack where he can make those sustained hits go off on a 5+ with an enhancement. Overall, I'd say it's most tempting in a hunting pack squad with a 20 strong unit, where he's maybe got some chance of having those damage and defense buffs go far enough. Kroot just aren't really ideally suited to being a mainline damage or defensive frontline unit though, which is what he seems to be trying to make them. And even being a really cheap character, he often doesn't even make the cut in competitive Kroot hunting pack lists, unfortunately. The Warshaper, again, only really seems to be one that you'd consider in hunting pack. He could give a big 20-man Kroot squad discounted stratagems and battle shock negation, plus has some better melee compared with the rest of the Shapers. And in particular in the hunting pack, again, he's got a focal enhancement that's quite good for him. The Root of Honour with the potential to have his bow giving some devastating wounds against infantry on a 3+. Again, feels like a character that's maybe going at cross purposes for their sort of skirmishing and objective role that the Kroot want to do, where ideally they might be kept cheap for that. He's usable enough in Kroot hunting pack, though still passed up plenty of times in that detachment still. Finally, for the Kroot Shapers, we've got the Trail Shaper. This one's 55 points, and it gives you redeploying his unit and another Kroot one, which could be handy enough with Far Stalkers. It means that you could infiltrate them into the midboard to deny enemy infiltrators the chance to set up there, and then think about pulling them back somewhere to safety. That could be quite disruptive against certain armies, I suppose. He's not quite as good as when there was Perfect Knowledge redeploys when he first released, though. His reactive movement is generally a useful enough rule to have as a bonus utility thing. He could make Kroot units annoying to skirmish on objectives, so just move away when the enemy gets close to them, but a D6 isn't that reliable. If fielded solo, he is the single cheapest infiltrator unit in the Codex, though is super fragile, so again isn't exactly ideal for that. Could be one option for a weird utility use though. And unlike the other Shapers, he really has little damage indeed, just with a standard Kroot rifle. Again, he feels a bit on the niche side. He basically feels like a model that you'd use for high-level infiltrate sort of plays for controlling boards and perhaps doing some clever things at a grand tournament. I would have more use in the hunting pack, where there's going to be lots of Kroot units to redeploy, but again, seems super niche for the utility that he brings. Next up, we've got the Tau Plains in the Razor Shark and the Sun Shark. The Razor Shark's 170 points and the Sun Shark is 160. Outside of some slight tweaks in war gear and special rules, they do a very similar job, turning up with a whole bunch of ion shots, non-hover aircraft, so they have to turn up turn 2. And then with the aircraft keyword, it does mean that they can fire over ruins, so if they can draw a direct line of sight, they ignore the obscuring ruin style rule. It could allow them to get some interesting enough lines of sight. The damage output isn't terrible for the points, and the Razor Shark gets a +1 to hit against fly things as well as a bonus, but compared with other units their durability is low. They're not going to be able to hide behind those obscuring ruins by the same rule. They do have very fast movement as aircraft, but it can just as much be a downside due to having locked movement after they've set up with their angle, and they can't really go where they want or contest objectives or anything like that. The Sun Shark's bombs are in a bad place in 10th edition as well, usually unable to use them before turn 3, so not the best use in the world there. I still generally rate them as far behind the on-the-board firepower options like the Tau tanks and battlesuits. They're maybe not quite as crazily far behind as some other factions' aircraft. Next up, we've got the enormous great big walking gun platform that is the Storm Surge, an enormous tanky gun turret that gets the towering keyword, so it means that if it tows into ruins then it can see over them if it can draw a direct line of sight, which is handy enough for getting firing lanes. All of its firepower getting seriously accurate if it can stay still for a turn. Not always going to be possible, but when it can, it could hit big. And then really quite a lot of different weapon systems matched all over it. Perhaps most intimidatingly, an enormous damage 12 profile that can one-shot certain enemy battle tanks and be a big threat to knights. Then adding in a bunch of things to slay infantry and some nice destroyer missiles. It feels like it's one of the bigger winners of the Tower for the Greater Good update, as it now gets no specific penalty to splitting fire, and that's really quite nice for the secondary weapon systems. I still think its main issue is going to be direct competition from all the very efficient firepower that the Tower can bring to the table though. You can near enough have 3 Skyray gunships for the same price as this, or 4 broadsides. I just rate those as overall stronger between damage, defense and utility, though maybe not by a crazy enormous amount. I feel like the Storm Surge, being a big Titanic single threat unit, is going to be one of the ones that works maybe a bit better in more casual games as opposed to hyper competitive ones. Big intimidating tough profiles can be a little bit harder there if lists aren't hyper optimized, and might do better on tables that have lesser terrain perhaps. Moving onwards and upwards though, here we have tier 2. I've split this one into 2 halves. These are the ones that I've rated on the lower half of tier 2. Maybe getting to the point where they're usable and I think they've got some solid draw. They still maybe tend to be niche picks and outcompeted by other things on the competitive scene for the most part. Commander Farsight I'd probably put towards the upper end of this tier. He's 95 points and definitely brings some interesting stuff to the table. A punchy close range plasma rifle, some actual tower melee with strength 10 and damage 3, a discounted stratagem for his crisis unit, and a +1 to wound buff if they can get close. They do have to get within 9 inches to be able to trigger that, and that's not ideal out of deep strike, usually making him the best fit with the retaliation cadre, which could allow you to deep strike in close, and he can discount the stratagem to do so. The 6-inch deep strike limit on that still hurt a bit though, given that you can no longer just drop him straight into melter range with a whole bunch of fusion suits, though it still feels like maybe one of the best ways to use him, and most reliably trigger his buffs without having to worry too much about it. Overall though, he definitely has a whole bunch of utility. Cheap strats, some melee, some shooting, a good shooting buff, and an alright defensive profile as well. His 8 wounds with a 2+ save, all of that taken together does make him really quite valuable, but just maybe kind of hard to make perfect use out of all of it at the same time. And the melee thing isn't always ideal for a crisis suit unit, given that most of the squad don't want to be in melee, and Farsight himself might kill a couple of Space Marines or something, but isn't going to be wiping out entire units. He maybe suffers a bit from retaliation cadre not having the success of things like Montcar at the moment. Next up, we've got the Fire Warrior Strike team. Far less played versus the Breacher team, though I still think they have some good value for 75 points. They're cheap high OC troops with alright volume fire with a whole bunch of strength 5 and damage 1, -1 to wound with a Guardian drone within the unit to make them at least somewhat tanky for the points cost, a 4+ save, and the -1 to wound isn't terrible for 7.5 points per model essentially. They can clear out some light infantry and potentially ping one unit for a -1 to hit debuff, which if they can manage it really doesn't hurt into a big scary enemy damage dealer that's likely to survive the turn. They do remain far less dangerous than breaches with a Cadre Fireblade for the Devilfish support role though, and I still rate them stronger at the moment. I've seen a good few competitive lists choosing to take a unit or so of these though, often just one. I feel like between their OC, damage and defense, and debuff rule there's enough interest there, plus they could bodyguard an ethereal if you wanted to use one of those as well, as one option to keep them safe. Next up we've got the Kroot Hounds, 40 points for 5 of them or 80 for 10, unfortunately no longer living up to the meme of 250 in a list anymore. I feel like they're interesting enough for cheap nuisance units though. They can scout and have a big 12-inch move, which means they could zoom forward and get in the way of enemy units, do nuisance charges, maybe do certain secondary objectives. They seem like a fairly ideal throwaway unit to zoom towards enemy units to hand out firepower buffs in the auxiliary cadre. They can charge after advancing if there's some Kroot nearby, and they get OC1 if there's a Kroot carrot nearby. Though whether or not that's the case is going to depend on the list. It might often just be the case in Kroot Hunting Pack or maybe Auxiliary Cadre. And they do have some rivalry with a whole bunch of other cheapish scout style units. You could have Krutox Riders as single small annoying units like them, and they cost the same points, or have a Piranha for a similar sort of battlefield role for 20 points more. That's really quite a lot more threat and toughness. Small units do have some values all of their own though, and I feel like they're usable in some very small numbers. Next up, we've got the Krutox Rampagers, melee tower for 85 points for 3 of them, or 170 per 6. For the cheap points of these, you do really get quite a lot of wounds and stats now. With 15 wounds at toughness 6 at that price tag, most things aren't going to be enormously efficient at killing them, and on the charge they're going to have a massive amount of volume that's going to clear out any sort of medium to lighter infantry units dead fast, and can even punch up a touch against tougher things with their mortal wound impact hits. They could act as a cheap counter-charge unit in a more balanced tower list, perhaps hiding behind a ruin after scouting into the mid-board and then lurking there. They're going to be extra standout in the Kroot Hunting Pack and Auxiliary Cadre though, where both of those can give them some really quite serious melee buffs. They really quite like the core rules of Kroot Hunting Pack, and in particular the Invulnerable save as well. And about half of the Auxiliary Cadre stratagems feel like they were made for them, allowing them bigger threat range and hitting extra hard when they get there. It could be a good choice for the hide a unit stratagem in Hunting Pack as well. Perhaps their biggest weakness is low movement and the mounted keyword, which might mean that it's hard to keep them hidden behind terrain and then actually get a charge on something. 7-inch movement really isn't loads for those restrictions, and more limited support in things like Montcar, Kauyon, Retaliation and Experimental Prototype Cadre does mean they often get passed over there, even if I feel like they're fairly usable for their stats. I'd rate them as another unit that's likely to be stronger in more casual play as opposed to competitive, just getting lots of chunky stats on the table, even if they might be a bit cumbersome to bring to bear. I still likely rate them towards the upper end of this tier, or maybe in the upper tier too if I was being generous. Next up we've got Krutox Riders, 40 points for a single one, then 60 or 90 for 2 and 3, so a little cheaper for the bigger units. In their single model role though, they can be a cheap individual unit for screening and disruption. They've got the same defense profile as the Rampagers, so they're going to take at least a little bit of focus fire to bring one down, and against enemy interlopers and deep strikers they do have a small amount of meaningful damage, with a bunch of strength 6 and 7 AP1 and damage 2 attacks between their range and melee. Their reactive shooting rule might occasionally trigger something and do something meaningful, though maybe not the biggest thing to focus on I think. I feel like it's pretty reasonable that you could field a good number of them in Hunting Pack once again. Again, they'll be getting better in the Kroot focused detachments. They maybe don't feel like they're one of the most mainstream Tau units, but do have some interest both in an individual model role for screening out bits of the board, with some okay stats for the cost while doing so, and a bit of objective control innately, unlike Kroot Hounds, and the discounted points cost means they could be interesting in bigger units as well in the detachments that support them. Finally, we've got the Kroot Farstalkers, which are probably rated towards the lower end of this tier or upper tier 3. They're a slightly horde-style unit with infiltrates. That's always got some interesting value at least. Having at least some infiltrators is generally great news, as it means that these guys could deny places on the board for the enemy infiltrators to set up, or maybe stop enemy scouts moving up into the mid-board if you had lots of World Eaters trying to get close to the tower maybe. And they could be in the right place to do some early game move blocking and shutting down movement lanes, so keep a chunk of the enemy army trapped in their deployment zone for a turn, or maybe do first turn secondary objectives. As mentioned, they could maybe combo with the Trail Shapers redeploys, screen out the mid-board, and then pull back to somewhere safer once you've denied the infiltrator options. And beyond that, they do have some damage output, though mainly against light infantry. They mark one unit for lethal hits and precision. I feel like whichever way you slice it, their damage output is still going to be really quite poor for the points. I'd probably just take the one unit of them to use as the infiltrate style role. I'd be more tempted to in hunting pack with the invulnerable save that they might quite like to just increase their survivability a tiny bit. Or maybe auxiliary cadre where they could be a unit to lay down the Kroot damage buffs by getting close early. In general though, I feel like if you want an infiltrator style unit, then maybe the Pathfinders might be the way to go, presuming that you're trying to be cagey with the stealth suits and not get them killed too quickly, as they get infiltrate 2 or an 80 point unit that also has fairly godly utility for the army. For most armies, I'd be more tempted to take those over Farstalkers. Moving onwards and upwards though, here are the units that are rated in the upper end of tier 2, perhaps getting towards some of the stronger and more slightly standout Tau units now. First up, we've got the broadside battlesuits, 90 points for 1, 180 for 2 or 300 for 3, so an outside cost for the bigger units, and pretty solid and scary anti-tank profiles with their rail rifles, and then some fire support from missile drones potentially, and really quite a lot of interesting and usable support systems between seeker missiles, plasma rifles, and the weapons support system. All of those are at least fairly tempting. They're at least adequately tanky in cover with a 2+ saves, and nice to have a bit of mortal wound protection even if it is a pretty weird datasheet rule for them. I feel like maybe their main downside versus the other tower fire support out there is the fact they're really quite slow. The tanks and riptides can move far faster, though Montcar certainly helps them out quite a bit, being able to advance and shoot with them to at least get some easier lines of sight in the early game if they need to move around and draw them. Currently they are seeming to be a bit less popular than the other long-range tower fire support for top placing lists currently. They do basically feel like they're doing a similar sort of job, but not being able to move quite so fast. I'd be more tempted by Skyrays in particular for a similar sort of anti-tank role, but plenty of people still like them, and they still remain strong and scary fire support, maybe going to be notably better on maps with lesser terrain, even more so than the slightly faster moving fire support that can move around and get angles and push up quickly when needed. Next up, we've got Commander Shadowton herself, 100 points for a stealth battlesuit lone operative. She's just got a massive amount of utility rules all stacked together for just 100 points. Fast lone operatives in the first place are pretty handy to have for screening areas of the board, not being able to be interacted with, and maybe doing secondary objectives. But alongside that, she's got a whole bunch of things that chip in both to army synergy and to direct damage. She has 2 ballistic skill 2+ strength 10 melter weapons, which is already quite a good start. A fair bunch of some spammed anti-infantry fire, which might be able to take a chunk out of a 1 wound infantry squad. And if anything does tag her, then she can't be locked up. She can fall back and shoot to full effect. For a lone operative, her toughness is adequate, I'd say. 6 wounds with a Guardian drone, an invulnerable save, and stealth, hopefully having at least a good shot of surviving 1 unit's firepower depending on how scary it is. And then she's got her 2 army synergy rules with an aura of reroll 1s to hit, which is pretty handy. In theory that could be a big damage buff to quite a lot of units, though it does overlap with certain other unit rules and in particular with stealth suits if they're guarding against 1 target, so often could be a bit redundant there. She's also got an aura of a chance to regenerate command points on a 5+, which is very unreliable, but whenever that happens that'll be a fairly big win and give you an extra powerful tool to produce a swing in the game. Tau don't have a massive amount of command point farming besides her and ethereals. Between all that, I think she's an interesting unit and definitely has some cool options. I'd rank her towards the upper end of this tier or maybe lower tier 1. Next up, we've got the Crisis Battlesuits. I feel like after Games Workshop's messed around with their points a fair few times over, they're in a place where all 3 units are viable and interesting depending on what you want to do with them. Either way, you get 4 wounds at toughness 5 with a 3+ save, vehicle keyword units with some alright movement and deep strike. I feel like they're most often tempting as sort of big central combo damage dealer style units, usually with a commander taking an enhancement. Quite a few of the detachments have a bunch of enhancements that are really quite solely aimed at Crisis commanders. They can be fairly central units in retaliation cadre, in particular some damage buffs up close, maybe alongside Farsight while doing so, though it has had a bit less tournament success than most recently. I feel like it's been hovering around the sort of 40% win rate for quite some time now. They also do quite well in experimental prototype cadre as well, with some helpful shooting stratagems and the core range boost helping out things that are 12-inch range in particular. They also have some nice commander options to make the commanders extra shooty too. And Montcar and Calyon still help out with damage buffs. As mentioned, I think all three of the units are pretty well balanced for their intended roles given the points. Some Forges priciest at 150 points, with shield generators but 2 fusion guns, and then inbuilt rerolls 2 wound and damage there. As mentioned, they might enjoy the Farsight close drop. The Fire Knife suits are the mid price of 130. They can take plasma or stay standoffish with missiles. They get their big hit rerolls against things that haven't been damaged yet. Often means they could be fired at the start of a shooting phase. Anything that buffs AP will be quite good with those missile pods. There's a fair few stratagems that are able to do that, and they might enjoy both the jump shoot jump stratagem in retaliation or the Star Flare one to bound around on and off the board. Then there's the cheaper Star Scythe suits. They're 110 points for the anti-infantry version, packing flamers or burst cannons. They get extra AP against infantry, which is pretty nice. The flamers get on pretty well with the retaliation cadre buffs, who also like extra range as well. Overall, I'd rate them all as strong and interesting units depending on what you want to achieve. They've got loads of options open to them in all manner of different attachments, though maybe with recent Montcar and Calyon focus they're maybe not quite as widely played, but still pretty focal units in retaliation and experimental prototype. To lead them into battle, there's either the Cold Star Commander or the Enforcer Commander. They're 95 points and 80 points respectively. As mentioned previously, they're central units with a bunch of dangerous guns, plus being some of the best users of enhancements out of the Tau army, a lot of things are geared to them. They often want to take a Cyclic Ion Blaster, which is just really quite general purpose, and then most of the options are at least fairly interesting beyond that, maybe plasma, missiles or fusion. The Cold Star can take the high output burst cannon as well, which is a particularly nice one, particularly alongside Star Scythe. They get on well with the battlesuit relevant detachments, particularly for the enhancements. They quite like Exemplar of Calyon as well for sustained hits early. And then the Cold Star battlesuit makes his squad faster with the ability to advance and shoot and boost movement outright. Maybe nice with close range suits that don't want to deep strike in. The Enforcer is pretty tanky and reduces AP against the units. Maybe extra nice for the non-shield generator suits, perhaps with the Fire Knife as a good pairing with him. Could be a good option for deep strike or that Starflare ignition system in retaliation. Overall, they're really quite solid and scary for the cost, and both them and Crisis battlesuits would be top tier in their own detachments. Next up, we've got the Cadre Fireblade. 50 points for a pretty massive damage increase to Breacher shooting, a strong leader choice for Breached in Devilfish, giving you +1 shot on a 2-shot profile for the most part, and also helping out his own profile and any drones along. He can contribute some gun drones and also has a bit of damage 2 shooting with extra AP on 6s, and could be a choice to bear enhancements, though I feel like ones that want to go on him are kind of niche, particularly if he's in a transport. I feel like it's a strong choice, but maybe a touch on the take or leave side. Maybe the difference between Breachers outright just ruining one target, but also means that you've then got an 150 point unit that's sat in the midfield that's really not all that hard to kill, so you potentially lose more points in return. Either way, he'll be better in Montcar and Calyon as well, both of which have some Devilfish relevant stratagems and tend to favour Breachers more than maybe some of the others, though they could be okay in experimental too. Next up, there's Dark Strider, 60 points and a fairly popular utility unit. He's a model that's got a whole bunch of different options, and he could use them in different ways depending on the opponent. If he attaches to Pathfinders, he could give them a +1 to wound, which makes them pretty savage with their special weapons. It does make the unit rather pricey though. And otherwise, he's a cheap infiltrator unit, not quite as cheap as the Lone Spear, but could be deployed individually if that made more sense. Or if the enemy's got a bunch of deep strike reserves, he could be a choice to zone out part of the backfield with a big 12-inch deep strike denial bubble. Just lurking around in the base for a ruin or something like that, and stopping the enemy getting anywhere near, maybe even defending the home objective. It could be quite big against 6-inch deep strikes. Overall, between all that, he feels really quite usable. I'd rate him as maybe a model that's stronger for competitive play than casual, given that he's got very little durability if fielded singly, and maybe more interesting for point scoring. He could also have some hard counters as well if the enemy's got some indirect fire, and maybe make him more tempting to jump in with the Pathfinders, and just use him as more of a damage buff there. Finally, for this part of the tier, we've got the Ethereal for 50 points. The Tau Brainwasher in Chief can farm command points on a 4+. It is unreliable, but really not too bad for 50 points. I feel like there's a good chance that if you can keep him doing that all game long, you're going to have a good amount of his value generators. And then beyond that, he can be a cheap placeholder unit. You could even potentially put him in strategic reserve and generate command points even while off the board, turning up turn 3 to do any secondaries as needed. He could just hide in the base of a ruin in the deployment zone, or if you've got a strike team on the board, he can give them a 5+ feel no pain, and that does make them legitimately tankier, maybe on a home objective. 125 points for that overall combo for some OC with good durability and spitting out command points seems alright for the overall cost, if maybe a bit of a luxury investment. Command points are definitely handy to have though. This guy doesn't really cost all that much to get a whole bunch more of them over the course of the game. Seems that plenty of people are choosing to take one along, though taking one does mean that you're not taking Farsight along as well, so one trade-off there between him. Finally getting towards the top of the Tau tier list though, and here in tier 1 are some of the units that I've rated as strongest, perhaps some of the ones that are most likely to turn up in tournament lists right now. Big hitting damage dealers and utility units to grab objectives, staples in a whole bunch of armies, and I have chosen to rank one slightly predictable unit above the rest. First up, we've got the Kroot Carnivores, 65 points for a unit of 10, and for that points cost, the biggest draw is to get sticky objectives into the army, which you can put down on the home field objective and make that all about yours for the rest of the game. And that can give you some interesting options later on, including maybe even abandoning the home field completely and pushing forward to the midboard if the opponent's got nothing left that can threaten it. If they can mark that there and then go scouting towards the midboard to cause some other problems and put their OC there, then that feels like it's an overall big win for them, and depending on how things fall, they might be in the position to actually deal some actual damage to some lighter enemy infantry. They do have a bunch of strength 4 attacks, they'll probably see any damage they do as a bit of a bonus. For downsides, they're really fragile and easy to kill with poor saves. As with other Kroot units, they might have more draw in the hunting pack or maybe auxiliary cadre. In particular, hunting pack gives them the invulnerable saves and incentivizes taking some of them in the 20 squad, though even there they might struggle as frontline units given their base stats. They feel like a hard unit to pass up one copy of though in a lot of Tau lists with their special rules and utility. Next up, and for some more auxiliary support goodness, we've got the Vespid Stingwings, 65 points for a unit of 5, 130 points for a unit of 10, they're typically tending to be fielded in the small units of 5. They're jump infantry that can move really quite fast on the board, though their particular standout rule is being able to bounce around the board and return to reserves each turn, and that means that when you have a secondary objective that needs a unit to drop down and do an action or be in one place of the board, they can do that, and then after that they go on to have further utility following that, then all well and good. If you happen to drop them somewhere where they can survive, or they do so unexpectedly, they could just jump straight back into the sky once more, or they could move forward to actually genuinely try and inflict some damage. They do have some shooting that can do alright against Space Marine equivalents. They've got some synergies with the auxiliary cadre as well, though for the most part are a bit limited. They can't either guide stuff or be guided. They're really quite fragile and easy to kill for the points cost, and the bigger unit gets a few fun upgrades but ultimately just doesn't really do quite enough to justify the big investment, and you're probably going to be better off with other damage dealers really. Still though, it seems that a lot of people have settled on one unit of these as again being the sweet spot for them. Just super common to have one unit buzzing around and doing some grunt work to support the army and win the mission overall. Next up, we've got a third strong utility unit in the Piranhas, 60 points and usually fielded individually, though you can take them in big squadrons of 3 if you wanted. These are cheap and expendable Tau units to have on the front line. They can scout up 9 inches and then have a very fast 14-inch move, so they're usually going to be able to get where they want to go, to be able to do secondary objectives, or maybe block movement lanes and stop the opponent moving forward, or even do completely annoyance nuisance charges to tie up the enemy turn 1, all of which are really quite good things for a cheapish price. But while they're doing that, they genuinely have a bit of threat as well. They get a fusion blaster, some gun drones, and then a pair of seeker missiles. So for the first time that they activate and shoot, they are actually going to hit the enemy genuinely very hard for the points cost. And if their damage output drops off a bit, it's not the end of the world if they might not have been expected to survive that long anyway. Their toughness isn't loads, but it's not nothing as well. 7 wounds at toughness 7 with a 4+ save is at least going to take a bit of focus to take down, hopefully drawing some damage away from other things ideally. They also have a bonus battle shock rule as well that might occasionally do something like prevent an enemy defensive stratagem or something. Usually going to be a bit niche in your own turn though. And again, like the previous couple, it's kind of hard to go too far wrong with small numbers of them for a utility role, maybe having 1 or 2 in an army list. Next up, we've got the great big stealth suit that is the Ghost Kill, and this one's a very interesting unit, having the lone operative special rule, but also having at least some fairly reasonable firepower on it, offering a bunch of punchy damage 3 ion shots that you can inflict completely from safety. Definitely interesting to have lurking around in the backfields or the flanks of the army, basically meaning that you can do some screening and board control things and still contribute a bit of damage to the game. Even if its damage output really isn't good for the cost, it does pay a big premium for that level of safety for it. So again, it's going to be a unit that's got its value balance between its damage dealing and its utility role. It probably makes sense to be a bit bolder and commit the Ghost Kill to the front lines, maybe towards the mid to late game, where it does actually have a fair bit of durability and could be annoying for the opponent to have to deal with. They get a 2+ save, cancelling damage twice per game, and stealth as well. and that kind of playstyle could fit quite well with Kauyon as well. Ideally they want more units to survive until the later game to get the big damage buffs army-wide. The Ghost Kill should be able to do that, and they also quite like the Kauyon Wall of Mirrors stratagem as well. Being able to warp Ghost Kills around the board could be really interesting, and particularly late game. As it pays the premium for the damage, it's likely going to be one to take in smaller numbers, maybe 1 or 2 of them once more. Definitely a seriously interesting and annoying unit to have to deal with though. Next up we've got the Riptide, a bit more of a chunky big stats front line style suit. Relative to its points cost in the past, it's still relatively cheap. It's got a good defensive profile with a good invulnerable save and a lot of 2+ save wounds. Again, not the most standout damage dealing in the world, but a fair bit better than the Ghost Kills, the Ion Accelerator having some fairly scary damage 4 shots, though its mid-strength means it's a bit better against heavy infantry, more so than against tanks, monsters and vehicles. At least it can be a bit more well-rounded in Montcar with lethal hits there though. The Riptide has a bunch of useful enough firepower support style rules, and in particular it's got fall back and shoot as well. So maybe compared with some Tau units, it's a bit more happy to be on the front lines, potentially being a bit bolder and getting lines of sight, but at the risk of being locked up in close combat, as nuisance things aren't going to be able to pin it down, and it's just going to hopefully be able to fall back and then light up the enemy with some heavy firepower once again. Most of the detachments have at least got something useful for it. Again, lethal hits with Montcar is really nice. It does have the battlesuit keyword with retaliation cadre, and doesn't mind getting close quite as much as some things in the Tau army. Overall, it still feels hard to go wrong with currently. Otherwise though, perhaps some of the more standout damage dealers are the Tau tanks, the Hammerhead at 145 points, and that's a big scary and dangerous battle tank with a great big gun on it. Both versions see play. I feel like I've seen more people using the Ion Cannon recently versus the Railgun, though both absolutely have some interest. Either D6 plus 3 shots at strength 8 and damage 3 versus a huge shot at damage D6 plus 6. It gets inbuilt rerolls, +1 to hit against monsters and vehicles, +2 seeker missiles to launch the first time that it fires, and some secondary weapons as well, often accelerator burst cannons, which did get quite a lot better in the updates given that they won't be hitting things on 5s quite so much as they used to be. Its durability isn't standout, but fine at 14 wounds for the 145 points I think, maybe not notably weak as battle tanks go. And overall I'd rate it as one of the scarier Tau damage dealers at the moment. Again, hard to go wrong with, really quite nice range and good firepower, and feels well balanced against its Skyray rival. Speaking of which, that has a very similar battlefield role, just a slightly different form of firepower. 3 attacks with strength 14, AP 3 and damage D6 plus 1, and getting twin linked, so re-rolling the wound rolls. That's going to be all very nice and pretty reliable firepower against big tough units all the way up to toughness 12 and 13. Compared with the Hammerhead, its damage output is maybe just a little bit less front-loaded, and a touch less swingy than the big Railgun if you wanted dedicated tank hunting. It doesn't get the bonus seeker missiles that the Hammerhead does, but just does that same output all game long. Otherwise there are lots of inbuilt rerolls, so usually doesn't need help from stealth suits quite so much. It gets bonus rerolls against fly things as well if you happen to be shooting against those. Again, really scary stuff and one of the go-to damage dealers to take down enemy heavies. Quite a popular unit and often seen in multiples. Next up, we've got Breaches in Devilfish. The Fire Warrior Breaches are 100 points and the Devilfish 85, usually taken together in a pair. The Devilfish being exactly what the Breaches want to get to the mid-board quickly and hit things very hard with their Pulse Blasters. Their base profile is 2 shots each at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1, with reroll wounds against enemies on objective markers, and at strength 6 that's going to stack a whole bunch of wounds on anything up to toughness 11, a bit less standard against T12. Then there's just loads of different buffs that can layer on them and be really quite effective. They'll get better with the +1 shot from him. They'll like any detachment relevant buffs that they can access, and they'll enjoy the experimental prototype one for extra range as well. The stratagems that increase AP will be liked quite a lot by them, and there's helpful stratagems for disembarking and re-embarking from transports in Montcar and Kauyon. Then if they are delivered onto a mid-board objective, they've got good objective control, and at least take a little bit of focus firepower to gun down with a Guardian drone for the -1 to wound. I still feel like with that though, the expectation is that they're probably going to get shot down against most lists. They're not really all that tanky, and particularly so for 100 points. Otherwise, the Devilfish are really quite efficient transports to get them where they need to be. Really good toughness for 85 points, 13 wounds at toughness 9. It does come with its own Alpha Strike with a pair of Seeker missiles, and then some spammed infantry killing fire after that between burst cannon and gun drones, and then can be just an expendable and annoying unit to do secondaries or nuisance charges or things like that after its transport contents have been delivered, and if it gets ignored. Overall feels like a really solid combo, perhaps a bit on the detachment dependent side though. Finally, before the final unit, I've also chosen to rank Pathfinders here. 90 points for Tau Infiltrators essentially, as they can get that with one of their drones that just seems auto-include to take that. And as with the other Infiltrator choices, provides all that good utility of zoning out part of the board, being in position to do early game secondaries, threatening some damage against enemy units that might be in the wrong places. doing nuisance things like move blocks or just camping on primary objectives straight away. It's really quite nice both to have infiltrate and scout on the same units, as the two work together really quite well. It means that you can deploy them fairly aggressively and then pull them back to within cover if the opponent gets turn 1, or think about setting up for damage if it makes more sense if you get it. And the damage output really isn't too bad. They can take 3 ion rifles, a grenade launcher, the burst cannon on the drone, plus a bunch of pulse carbine fire. Between all that, they should be able to bully a lot of sort of lighter midfield squads. Standard Space Marines and lighter infantry will feel a lot of that damage quite hard. And if they are doing some guiding, they'll be hitting on a ballistic skill 3+ as well. That's quite a big alpha strike there. If they absolutely wanted to max their damage output, they could even have Dark Strider along as well for a +1 to wound. Overall, they're really quite a cheap infiltrator style unit with a big punchy threat turn 1. Maybe a little bit on the pricey side for an infiltrator squad that usually want to be as cheap as possible. 90 points is a bit more of an investment. They do have some pretty awesome options. Alternatively, they could be an option for a Devilfish style combo. You can scout the Devilfish with them in it, which is quite a big advantage. Again, that could be one way to deliver their punchy ion shots. In general though, people seem to rate Breaches as overall more worth it between their damage and their OC and things. Finally, that just leaves us with one, and maybe no big surprise that its stealth suits have chosen to rank in the S tier. S for stealth suit, I suppose. Games Workshop still having the sort of unusual system where Tau Empire armies are at least to a fair point built around stealth suits, buffing units and guarding them, just being far better than the vast majority of other things that can guard against targets, getting reroll 1s to hit and wound, and a marker drone inside the unit, so if they're on the board, you just get a fairly astronomical focal damage buff against marked targets, more so than if it was just guided normally. If anything, that seems even more important now that one stealth suit unit can mark a target and then the entire rest of the army can have that rather great damage boost, and that's still easily well worth the increased cost of 80 points. Still, maybe it feels a bit on the odd side to give them quite such a powerful buff, as it does make them absolutely thoroughly auto-include for just about every Tau list that isn't really focused on the auxiliaries, and that is going to be even more the big standout focus of their role now that they've gone up in cost, though they could be used for some other utility things, with infiltrate potentially, though you wouldn't want to get them killed too early. They do have some threat of their own with some burst cannons and a fusion blaster. They're not super slow, and they have the infantry keyword as well, and they could do a free rapid ingress to crisis suits nearby. It's really quite dependent on how the opponent chooses to move forward with their units though as to whether or not that really works. Definitely could be an option to look out for with crisis suits though. If you do have a unit of reserve and multiple squads of stealth suits on the tabletop, one of them might have a good drop zone. Overall still seems to stand out great. Looks like in the new rules not every single army is always using 3 squads of them now. It's maybe more sort of 2 or 3. Though I guess you could argue that you don't necessarily always need as many of them if you've got the potential of one squad to buff most of an army's worth of firepower into one thing. But at the same time, it still might be tempting to take more for redundancy if they do get wiped out and focused. In any case though, let me know your thoughts as to the units of the Tau Empire down in the comments below. Which ones have been working out for you recently since the big update that Games Workshop's done? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas, and would you have rated any of the units higher or lower than where I put them? I'll leave that there for now, though I'll just quickly cycle back to Tabletop Tech, who as mentioned sponsor this video, and if you want to get some Tau from A to B in safety, they've got their rather fun clippy Mechi carry cases. These ones certainly work a bit differently to most carry cases out there. I feel like they do come with some of their own pros and cons versus foam and magnets and things. I feel like they generally might work a bit better for more established armies where you've got one setup and things don't change out crazily often, as switching around could mean needing to get new components and things like that. I've seen people say that they're maybe a little on the over-engineered side, taking a touch of time to operate each individual component, and they are maybe a little bit on the lightweight side compared with some cases, maybe not wanting to give them quite as much punishment as some boxes out there perhaps. They definitely come with a whole bunch of positives though. They look really quite nice and are pretty satisfying to use with their little machinery style bits. A lot of them have good balances between model transport versus display. There's no need to take the extra hobby effort of mounting magnets to the bases, and swapping out between components and things certainly can be done. Perfectly possible to reconfigure setups. For a few more examples of their things, they've got some really quite big slider frame style ones. This big 24 style one should have enough room for a good number of 2000 point 40k armies. There's a massive Crimson Fist force taking residence in this one currently, all held in by those grippy components. They've got the more standard slider cases and their frame cases as two of their main options for their transport. And other more funky uses of their stuff like some fun light up wall displays too. Here's a few of my own Space Marines hanging out in one. For guidance on getting the case together and matching your miniatures with an appropriate case, they've got a live web store chat, and that could be a good area to ask some basic questions as to their setups and what might be best. In any case, you can check out their web store, link down in the video description below. There's a discount code Auspex for 10% off any purchase through them, so a little bit on the cheaper side if you use that. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel and the creation of future videos, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description. Channel patrons having a few advantages, such as seeing occasional videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways each month. A big thank you to anyone supporting there, and a massive thank you to all for listening. I'll hope to see you guys next time.